The wind howled outside, a shrieking cry that pierced through the night. The snow had been falling heavily for hours, blanketing the small, isolated town in an eerie white silence. Inside a modest, aging house, the flickering light of a single candle cast long shadows against the walls. Claire sat by the window, her breath fogging up the glass as she peered into the darkened world beyond. The roads were deserted, the world muffled beneath the thick, oppressive snow. It had started earlier in the evening, a soft flurry that gradually built into a violent storm. The phone lines had gone down first, then the electricity. Now, hours later, Claire felt the stillness growing heavier, as if something else was waiting in the darkness, just out of sight. Her thoughts drifted to the warnings she had ignored earlier that day. The townspeople had spoken in hushed tones about the old legend, the one that resurfaced every time the first heavy snow fell. "Stay inside," they had whispered. "Don't go out after dark. Never, not on a snow night." Claire had laughed it off, her skepticism stronger than her fear. But now, with the storm raging outside, she wasn't so sure. A soft knock echoed from the door. Claire's heart skipped a beat. It was a slow, deliberate sound, one that made her skin crawl. Who could be out there in this weather at this hour? She hesitated, the room cold despite the crackling fire. Another knock came, and then a voice, faint but clear through the wood, calling her name. "Claire, it's me. Let me in." Her blood ran cold. The voice was unmistakable. It was Daniel's, her older brother who had vanished 3 years ago without a trace. The last time she had seen him, he was standing at the threshold, his face pale, eyes wide with terror, warning her of something she would never understand. "Don't go out tonight," he had said, his voice trembling. "Whatever you do, don't go out." The wind outside screamed louder, and the snow whipped against the windows with increasing violence. Claire's pulse raced, her thoughts racing even faster. Daniel had been missing for years. There were no answers, no clues, just the empty space where his presence had once been. She hadn't even believed in the supernatural, not really, but now, she wasn't sure. She moved toward the door, her legs stiff with fear, her hand trembling as it hovered over the cold doorknob. As her fingers brushed the metal, the door suddenly banged against the frame with a force that made her jump. The room went still for a moment, the air thick and suffocating. Then, from somewhere deep within the house, came a low whisper. Her name. The voice was faint, but unmistakably close. "Claire." She turned, wide-eyed, and there, standing in the doorway of the living room, was a figure. A tall, gaunt silhouette, its face obscured by the shadows. Claire couldn't move. The room seemed to tilt, the walls distorting, as the figure took a slow step forward, its presence pressing down on her like an invisible weight. Then it spoke again, its voice hollow and distant. "It's not him." Claire's breath caught in her throat. The figure was right. It wasn't Daniel. It couldn't be. But if it wasn't him, then what was it? With shaking hands, she backed away, her gaze never leaving the figure. She reached for the candle, holding it up like a fragile shield against the growing darkness. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, silent, waiting. Outside, the snow had stopped falling. The silence was complete, an oppressive void that stretched endlessly. But then, in the far distance, Claire heard something, a faint crunching sound, like footsteps on fresh snow, slow and deliberate. They were getting closer. And then, from the corner of her eye, she saw something shift in the shadows near the window. Her pulse hammered in her chest as she turned to look. A pair of eyes gleamed back at her from the blackness beyond the glass. Dark, wide, unblinking. The face was pale and frozen in a grimace, as if it had been staring in at her for far longer than she realized. She turned away, breath shallow, heart pounding. "I need to leave," she whispered to herself. "I need to get out of here." But as she reached for the door, the handle was cold and slick under her fingers. The air around her seemed to thicken. A heavy, suffocating fog filling the room. The darkness outside was pressing in, squeezing the very life from the walls, from her chest, as if the night itself was alive, hungering for something. She pulled the door open with a force that startled her, and there, in the snow-choked yard, stood a figure. Not Daniel, she could see that now, but something far worse. The shape was tall and thin, its limbs unnaturally long, its face distorted in a grotesque mask of frozen terror. Its eyes burned with an unnatural light, the pupils black as ink, its mouth a gaping hole of jagged teeth. It tilted its head to the side, a hollow sound escaping from within its chest. Before Claire could scream, it lunged, and everything went dark. The wind had stopped. The snow, too. The world was frozen in place, an unnatural stillness settling over the town. Claire's body lay in the snow, eyes wide open, staring into the emptiness. And from the distance, a voice whispered through the silence. "It's not over." Somewhere, in the deepest parts of the storm, the night was waiting to claim its next victim, and as the clock struck midnight, the legend of the Snow Knight was reborn. The wind returned, colder than before, swirling around the desolate house with a hunger that seemed to resonate from deep within the earth itself. Claire's body lay still in the snow, but the world around her seemed to shift. The ground beneath her felt wrong, like it wasn't quite solid. Her limbs stiffened, not from the freezing cold, but from a weight that pressed down on her, pulling her deeper into the earth. The sky above was no longer the pale, moonlit expanse it had been. Now it was a black, oppressive dome that closed in around her, suffocating. Her eyes, frozen wide in terror, still saw something that shouldn't have been there. The tall figure, the one that had stood in her living room, was now hovering just above her body, its long, shadowy limbs stretching unnaturally. Its eyes gleamed with that same awful, otherworldly light. It had followed her into the snow, pulling her into its domain, and it wasn't alone. Around her, the ground began to crack like the earth was breathing as more figures emerged from the white abyss. Each one was twisted, gnarled and tall, their features blurring into the darkness. They circled her, their eyes gleaming like mirrors reflecting something horrific. A past she couldn't fully recall, but felt deep within her bones. A voice echoed in her mind. It was Daniel's voice, though distorted, stretched thin like the howling wind itself. "You should have listened. You should have stayed inside." The memory of her brother's warnings flashed before her, his frantic eyes, the panic in his voice when he'd begged her to stay inside, to not venture out after dark. The snowstorms, the legend, the cursed nights when the town disappeared from the world, only to return to it years later with something different. Now Claire understood. The snow, the figures, the thing in the yard. It wasn't just some haunting. It was the very manifestation of the town's curse, and it had come for her. The ground beneath her cracked again, and the figures reached down with long, spindly hands, their fingers like icicles, sharp and cold. Claire's breath quickened. her body still unable to move as if bound by an invisible force. She tried to scream, but no sound came. The creatures leaned in closer, their faces forming out of the darkness, eyes wide, empty, their mouths twitching into twisted grins. Then, something broke through the suffocating darkness. A figure, smaller, human, appeared in the distance, moving with a hurried but deliberate pace. Claire's mind screamed for her to see who it was, but the creatures began to shift again, closing in on her. She could feel their presence surrounding her, the cold seeping into her very soul. The figure came closer, emerging from the fog of snow, and Claire's heart skipped a beat. But it wasn't really Daniel, not anymore. His face was pale, a ghostly version of the brother she had known, but it was his eyes, black as the night sky, full of hunger and emptiness, that told her this was not the same person. His mouth, now twisted in a grin far too wide, opened as he knelt beside her, whispering in a voice that was no longer his own. "It's too late to escape, Claire. This place. It takes you. It takes everyone. We are part of the night now." His hand touched her face, cold as the grave, and Claire felt a sharp pain shoot through her chest. It was like her very essence was being torn from her, sucked away by the darkness around her, piece by piece. Her vision blurred, the snow swirling faster, becoming a vortex of black and white, and for a moment she thought she saw faces in the snow. Faces she recognized, but twisted and contorted beyond recognition. They reached for her, whispering, calling her name in voices that echoed from a time before, a time when the town was whole. Suddenly, the world seemed to shatter. The figures around her began to dissolve into mist, their forms disintegrating as the snow consumed them. The ground groaned, cracking open, and Claire was pulled upward, her body weightless. Daniel, no, the thing that had once been him, was gone. She was alone, but for the horrible sense of presence that pressed against her, suffocating her. Then a voice, not Daniel's but another, darker, far colder, whispered through the air. "The snow night claims its own. You will not be free, not now, not ever." Claire tried to scream again, but her voice was swallowed by the silence, the storm's roar dimming into a deathly quiet. The snow stopped, but the cold never did. She found herself back in the house, standing in the living room, the fire still crackling softly in the hearth. Everything was still. The walls were the same, familiar, but now they seemed wrong. The air was thick with something unnatural, and the silence was overwhelming. But when Claire looked at the window, she saw it. The town, the streets, the familiar houses. And yet, she knew. It was not the same town she had known. It had changed, twisted. The houses were like distorted versions of themselves, and the people, if they could be called people, walked with jerky, unnatural movements. Their eyes, empty and soulless, darted toward her, their faces frozen in eerie expressions. Something was very wrong. The door behind her creaked open, and Claire didn't need to turn around to know who it was. Yeah, Jinjia, Daniel's voice, soft, broken, came from the threshold. You've come home, Claire. Welcome back. But this time she knew there would be no escape. There was no going back to the life she had once known. The night had claimed her. The snow night had claimed them all. And now she was part of it. Somewhere, far off in the distance, the wind howled once more. But this time, Claire could hear the voices of the lost, echoing through the storm, calling her name. She closed her eyes, knowing that the snow night would never end. Not for her, not for anyone. The legend had been reborn, and it would always come back when the snow began to fall. Claire stood frozen in the centre of the room, her heart pounding in her chest as the world around her twisted further. The house, the town, had become a dark mirror of everything she once knew. Nothing felt real anymore. Not the fire crackling in the hearth, not the flickering shadows on the walls, and certainly not the soft, broken voice that had come from the doorway. Welcome back, Claire. She could feel his presence, feel Daniel's eyes upon her, but the person standing in the doorway wasn't her brother anymore. The air was thick with an unnatural chill, and as she turned to face him, she saw it clearly. His face was pale, almost translucent, like something caught between life and death. His eyes were black as pits, empty and hollow, as if the very essence of his soul had been erased. His smile was wide, twisted, and wrong, stretching unnaturally across his face. You're not Daniel," Claire whispered, her voice cracking with terror. Daniel, the thing that had once been Daniel, tilted its head slightly, the smile never leaving its face. It took a step forward, moving with a jerky, mechanical motion. No, Claire, not anymore. I've been waiting for you. We all have. Claire's breath quickened, her hands shaking as she backed away from the figure, her feet unsteady beneath her. Her mind raced, trying to make sense of what was happening. The town, the house, the figures, everything had changed, but there was one thing she knew for sure now. The curse that had trapped them all in this endless night, this endless winter, was no mistake. The snow night wasn't a legend, it was a prison. A cycle that repeated itself, trapping the souls of the living and the dead, all bound by the dark forces that inhabited the night. The town, the people, they were all part of it now. The door behind her slammed shut with a deafening thud, the sound reverberating through her bones. She spun around, her heart racing, but the space behind her was now just another blank, empty wall. She was trapped. She turned back to Daniel. No, not Daniel. Not anymore. The figures that had once surrounded her in the snow now appeared again, emerging from the walls, stepping through the very shadows themselves. They walked with the same eerie, unnatural movements, their eyes vacant and soulless, fixed on her with a relentless hunger. They had been waiting for this moment, the moment when she, like all those before her, was claimed by the snow night. Please, Claire choked, her voice barely a whisper. I don't want this. I don't want to be part of this. Please let me go. But the figure that had once been Daniel took another step closer, his voice colder now, more distant. "You've always been part of it, Claire. You just didn't know it. You belong here. The Snow Knight calls us all." With that, the world around her seemed to collapse into darkness. The fire in the hearth sputtered and died, leaving only an oppressive silence. The walls, the town, the figures, they all faded into shadow, replaced by a yawning void that seemed to stretch on forever. Claire felt herself being pulled toward it, as if the very air around her was siphoning away her essence. Then, in the blink of an eye, the darkness gave way to the cold, blinding light of a storm that raged outside. The snow, thick and suffocating, whipped against the windows with ferocious force. And within that storm, Claire saw faces. Dozens of them, twisted and frozen in eternal horror, pressing against the glass, their eyes wide with terror, their mouths open in silent screams. She understood, in that moment, that the town had never disappeared. It was trapped in the Snow Night. And she was a part of it now, a prisoner, a lost soul, doomed to wander in the dark for eternity, her name just one more whisper in the cold wind. As the clock struck midnight, the storm raged louder, and the figures in the house shifted, moving closer. Claire felt a cold hand on her shoulder, icy, bone-chilling. She turned slowly, and there, standing before her, was Daniel. His face was still that same twisted mask of horror, but in his eyes, Claire saw something: recognition. And in that recognition, she felt the pull of something ancient and dark. She knew now that the Snow Night was a curse for the living as much as the dead. The figures, the voices, the endless storm, they were all the same. "You'll learn, Claire," Daniel whispered, his voice hollow. "The Snow Night never ends, not for anyone." The last thing Claire heard before the darkness took her completely was the soft murmur of 1,000 voices, their words blending together in a single, unified chant. The Snow Night claims all who wander, and it never lets them go. Then there was nothing. Far outside, where the storm raged, a lone figure stood at the edge of the forest. Its eyes glowed with an unnatural light, watching as the snow continued to fall, blanketing the land. The Snow Night had claimed another soul. And as the first flakes of the new storm began to drift through the air, the town waited, quiet, still, and hungry, for the next one to come. And the cycle would begin again.